additional lecture and tutorial. Okay, so what about questions about the material? Anybody, any questions pop into your, if you can remember back to Monday, anything in that about the course overview and the kind of quick history material that you want to ask about? Nothing yet? Okay, well, I mean, bear in mind in future that, you know, if you do have something like that, jot down a note or something if it comes up. Obviously, you can also ask in the class itself. Usually there'll be enough time that if a question pops into your head while we're going through the material, I can usually take it as long as it's not too big a detour. But if there's something that occurs to you after the fact that you want clarity on, the tutorials are a place where we can look at that. What about the more recent stuff? Moore's Law, did that bring anything to mind? Anybody any questions about that? Okay, again, brilliant. That must mean I did it very well. There are no questions. That must mean it was all very clear and good. We'll say that's the reason, and not that you're all bored to tears. Okay, right. Well, if there's nothing coming from you, I will just go and pick up some stuff that I did leave on Monday, with the intention of coming back to it to fill this little section. So we'll continue with that. So this was a strand that is in the notes, but I skipped it on Monday. And it's just a bit more detail about the whole Ada Lovelace, Charles Babbage thing, which is a thing of particular interest to me. Yes, we'll go back here by a step. Oh yeah, I should, hold on a sec, there's a way to do this. I should have come out of this. It doesn't matter, it's only the tutorial. It won't be super formal. So on Monday, a fair number of you were familiar with Ada, fewer with Babbage. Those of you who know Ada probably know that she's sometimes described as being the first computer programmer. Are you familiar with that claim? Yeah. In fact, if you look at it, it's a little bit more subtle. If you read kind of reputable sources, what they often say is that Ada is sometimes said to be the first computer programmer, but they themselves don't quite say it. It's often done at one remove. And there's a reason for that. It's because it is actually a somewhat debatable point. There's questions here about just definition. What does it mean to be a computer programmer? And what would count as first? So there's a kind of, and then there's just some historical ambiguity about what really happened, and how much of Ada's paper was stuff that she did independently, or how much it was stuff that Babbage had supplied to her to for her to then write the article around it. So there's some things that are where the facts are uncertain, and other things where the definition is uncertain. So, I mean, and I'm not going to kind of browbeat you about it, but I would be kind of interested. Is there anyone out there who would say that they think that Ada was the first computer programmer? A claim that you think would be defended? So we've got at least one. Again, I don't want to put you on the spot, but broadly, how would you defend that claim? What do you think makes her the first programmer?
What I can understand, she was the first to think about computers for something other than calculations and numbers and stuff.
Right.
So, while she might not have necessarily written a program, she had this idea.
Okay.
The idea of programming a computer, I'd say, comes from her.
Right. So that's an interesting claim. Again, I'll try and paraphrase it in case the mic didn't catch it. So the claim there was that you can call Ada the first programmer because she had this insight into what computing could be. The fact that it wasn't just dry mechanical calculation. She kind of had the vision of what computing might be, and that kind of entitles her to having being like a proto-programmer, even if she maybe didn't have like an explicit program that you could point to that was hers. So that's certainly one way of looking at it. And you can see why it becomes a kind of a sort of a definitional question as to how you want to think about these things. I think the case is kind of tricky. I'm a big fan of Ada. I think her paper is really interesting. She's a fascinating person. I tend to be more sceptical of the claim that she was the first programmer now than I used to be. When I was a teenager, I learned about her when I was a teenager as well, and I thought, oh great, the first programmer, great. But when you think about it, it's kind of hard to make that call. But I mean, she's a notable individual, of course, though. So here's some evidence to let you think about that sort of claim. This is an actual quote from one of Lovelace's letters to Charles Babbage, where I've actually read a lot of the surviving letters between them during the period when she was writing her paper. And she says, I want to put in something about Bernoulli's numbers in one of my notes. This is the thing that she's famous for, like her notes on the analytical engine. One of the notes, called Note G, towards the end, has got a working out of a program to compute a mathematical series called the Bernoulli numbers, which are fairly sophisticated, and that's the one that it's often described as being that's complicated enough to count as the first program, and that's why some people give her credit for having done that. And she did indeed ask Babbage. She said she wanted to do it as an example of how a function could be worked out. Give me the necessary data and formulae. And this is one of the kind of little clinchers as to, well, what does this mean? What was she asking there? But the other thing about Ada, it's sometimes there are some kind of negative views of her that say that she didn't really do the work, and the suspicion is that Babbage gave her the program for the Bernoulli numbers. Because I mean, you see her sort of asking for it, but we don't know, was she asking for an equation, or was she asking for a worked example or something that she could include? So there's this kind of question as to whether the example programs in the paper might have come from Babbage, who, whether this is true or not, you have to think about it, right? Obviously, Babbage would have written programs, you see? You think about it. You don't design that machine and set your life about building it without having at least created some toy example programs, right? So when you start thinking, it's like, yeah, it's obvious that Babbage was the first programmer. He had to be. And in fact, there is evidence of this. There's stuff that's turned up in the archives. Primitive things, all these programs that we're talking about are very simple, and they're basically just calculating maths equations, right? It's just like, doing a kind of x equals minus b plus or minus the square root of b squared, all that kind of stuff, right? It's just calculating one of those, and the program is just a list of the calculations to do it. But it's obvious that Babbage was doing that, as in fact were Babbage's sons, who were also involved in this effort. So there were a bunch of people that were around working with Babbage who'd been writing example programs to just let them figure out what the machine would sort of be able to do. And so you have to bear that in mind. However, I am still basically kind of pro-Ada, and it's true that she wasn't a pushover. Some people think that that she was kind of Ada was semi-aristocratic, and it may have been useful for Babbage to have someone like her promoting the machine, because it was a way of him getting more exposure to his ideas, and it could seem it was an independent defence of his plans, and it would suit him if that happened. But I don't think she was a pushover. You can see that in her interactions with him, she's quite strident, and there's quite a big difference between them. When this letter that I've quoted here was being written, Ada's in her 20s, and Babbage is in his late 40s, and is considered to be one of the senior scientists in the country. And she's writing him letters, getting him in trouble for being annoying to her. I hope you do not take it upon yourself to alter any of my corrections, because she did actually correct things that were wrong in material Babbage gave her. And you have made a pretty mess and confusion in one or two places, which I will show you sometime, where you ventured onto my manuscript to insert or alter a phrase of word that would utterly have muddled the sense. And this is a sort of fair reflection of the back and forth between them. I should, of course, say they were very friendly. They were on very good terms, and unfortunately, Ada died quite young, but Babbage continued to speak well of her till late into his life. He lived a lot longer. But they had this back and forth where they were kind of iterating on the paper and the ideas they wanted to express in it, and it's a really interesting little interaction that they had. So here, in fact, if we jump ahead to Babbage's own memoirs, published much later, this is him reflecting on when Ada wrote the paper. And he says, I then suggested that she add some notes to Menabrea's memoir. Menabrea is the Italian guy who wrote the original paper, which was him writing down things that Babbage had said in a conference in, I think, France, although Menabrea was Italian, so I'm pretty sure that it was written in Italian. And then Ada translated that and appended the extra notes. This is the background to all this stuff. So I suggested that she add some notes, an idea which was immediately adopted. We discussed together the various illustrations that might be introduced. I suggested several, but the selection was entirely her own. So also was the algebraic working out of the different problems, except indeed that related to the numbers of Bernoulli, which I had offered to do to save Lady Lovelace the trouble. And this is the clincher, right? Because people say that although there are multiple kind of fragment programs in her paper, the Bernoulli one is seen as being the one that's complicated enough to count as being significant. And of course, if you count the others, then it means that Menabrea is the first programmer, because the original article that she's translating, you see, so you can't have it both ways. So if you say that, the Bernoulli numbers is the one that counts as the first non-trivial program, there is reason to believe that maybe Babbage actually did do that bit for her. but we can't really know. However, this she sent back to me for an amendment, having detected a grave mistake which I had made in the process. And this is true too. In fact, I'm afraid the paper in its published form has still got mistakes in it, it turns out, which seems to have gone relatively unnoticed for much of computing history, but a couple of pedants went over it with a fine-tooth comb and actually figured it all out, and it turns out there are a couple of mistakes, just as there would be in anything that you do. I mean, I don't know, when was the last time you wrote a program that worked first time for a computer that didn't exist yet, where you had to write the program on, not just like on paper, you had to write the program on like imaginary punched cards for a computer that was never actually built in your lifetime. It's like, of course there'd be a bug in it. In fact, and some of the mistakes in the paper are probably just printing errors, the typos, because again, this is like detailed instructions with lots of like subscripts and superscripts, and some of it's probably just that when the printers were mocking it up, you know, they put a 2 where a 3 should have been, stuff like that. But probably 1 or 2 of them were actual slight logical errors in the program. It's no big deal, it's the way life is. So this, in fact, is the program for computing Bernoulli numbers as it appeared in the original printing. It's kind of hard to see it at this scale. I don't know if I can zoom it up very well. Yeah, I can, great. So this is what programs looked like back in the early days. It's kind of mental. So first of all, this is simply the textual representation of the thing. The real program would indeed be put onto a punched card, which is even less readable than this. It would just be some holes in a card and some other things that are not holes, and that's a program. But what it's really doing is this is the code of it. It's describing, this is V2 times V3, V4 minus V1. The V's represent memory addresses. This is describing the store inside the engine. So these are just like pointers, as we would call them, right? This is the pointer to location 2, location 4. And these are the operations. It's just add, subtract, multiply, and divide. That's what it did. The analytical engine was just a machine that had a mechanical implementation of arithmetic, add, subtract, multiply, divide. And the one other thing that you need is some kind of conditional logic. And that's really kind of debates as to how well thought out Babbage had done this at the time, but it looks like he did have the concept of detecting when something went negative, right? And if you can say, oh, if this was negative, go and do this different instruction instead. You know, an if statement, right? You need an if statement. Without an if statement, you don't have Turing completeness. You would just have a machine that could run through, you know, some fixed series of calculations, and it would always just reach the same end result, right? But to be a real computer, you have to really detect conditionals, and whatever you say, your conditional might be, you know, is it greater than 10? But your machine hasn't got a is it greater than 10 thing in it. Well, what you do is you say, okay, subtract 10 from it, is it still greater than 0? And that's the way you do it, right? So you could always just do it by, are things greater or less than 0? And then you would tell it to, instead of going on to the next card in the sequence, could you go 5 cards ahead in the sequence? And that's a jump, you know, a go-to statement or an assembly language jump. And once you've got that, you've got what you need to do modern computing in the full sense. So anyway, that's basically the program here, just a list of simple arithmetic. This is the kind of algebra that would result from having done it, but this is like a comment, right? This is a comment for the human reader to make it easier to understand. So that shows what's going on, and you just kind of grind through it. And these bits here were supposed to be repetitive sections, so these are loops, although the exact details as to how the loop was done is not entirely clear. That's basically what it was, and it was just doing a whole bunch of maths. These are the working variables over here, so these are the memory locations. So this is like a debugger trace. This is basically like a debugger spying on your memory contents, and this would just kind of show you how the numbers were kind of flowing through the memory as it was getting to the end. And that's how it was all done. You can see some of this in the paper. This is the note G section of the paper where the Bernoulli numbers are being described. This is the maths that's behind it and how it's all going to work and everything. And then you see snippets of the actual code down here. So that's how it all worked. And it's fairly elaborate stuff. And then it's preceded by several pages of kind of run-ups with simpler examples. Again, another little trace of what was going, the kind of flow of a supposed program. I mentioned that there were mistakes in it. I've got that here somewhere, I think. Where did I put it? I opened a link somewhere. Maybe I'll get back here and do it from here. There we go. Mistakes were made, yes. So it turns out there are a couple of errors if you look at it closely. But as I say, they're fairly minor. They might be printing errors and stuff like that. Not a terribly big deal. So if nothing else, Ada, God bless her, deserves credit for being the first bug writer. So can we say that? Because she was the first person to try and write a program that's complicated enough that it would have a bug in it, right? Whereas the other ones were like, 4-line programs that were just like, 2 adds and a multiply, and it's like, how hard is it to get that wrong? So there are a couple of little things where some of these notations are a little bit wrong, and there's a bit where it's did a subtract where it should be doing an add, this kind of thing. And you weren't going to know that probably until you eventually built the computer and put it in and started debugging it. Okay, here's another little clip about that machine, which is, I think we can probably afford to show it to you. So.
An English gentleman named Charles Babbage designed the world's first true computer in the middle of the 19th century. He called it the Analytical Machine. An English lady, Ada Lovelace, daughter of the poet Lord Byron, produced the world's first computer program to operate the Analytical Machine. Well, the truth is, they never quite finished their machine. It was at least 100 years before its time. Current electricity, you see, had not yet been invented, so Babbage was restricted to using wheels and cogs to represent numbers in his computer. And to power the machine, he had to rely on a steam engine. He constructed models, but the complications of so many rods and wheels, and ratchets and gears, and the tolerances needed were too great for the technology of his day. And though he devoted most of his life and his personal fortune to the effort, it remained a practical failure. His programmer, Ada Lovelace, actually hoped to use the Analytical Machine to pick winners at the racetrack. Well, this didn't work out either. Babbage's Analytical Machine may have been a practical failure, but it had all the ingredients of a true computer. One, it had an input device. Babbage used stiff cards with holes punched in a particular pattern. He got the idea for this input device from an innovative French weaver named Joseph Jacquard. Jacquard invented a system that used a belt of cards with holes in them to make a desired pattern in woven cloth. His invention of 1801 was called a Jacquard loom, and in principle is still used today in modern weaving looms. 2, it had an arithmetic unit. Truly a number cruncher. It was called the mill and was a maze of wheels, rods, ratchets, and gears. 3, it had a control unit that could be programmed to tell the machine what to do and in what order. 4, it had a memory. Again, this was a complex maze of mechanical parts. 5, it had an output mechanism, a printer. His first attempt was powered by a hand crank. For the never completed model, he planned to use steam engine power.
Okay. And that, I think, is the end of that little strand. Any questions about that? Nope. Okie doke. Okay, well, there's one other thing I can do. There's a little bit more to say about Moore's Law, but I'm not going to dwell on it at length, but I'll throw some ideas at you that might stimulate you. So this is me switching back to the Moore's Law slides. There are just some questions at the end of it that are sometimes worth talking about in the tutorial. And again, it's just about getting the sense of scale related to what happens with this extraordinary growth curve that we've been on for the past 50 or 60 years as the transistor revolution has occurred and led to all the most of the technological changes that you'll have lived through and I lived through. Okay, so how many computers are there in the world? Any guesses? How would you even go about estimating a thing like that? Have a go. This is the kind of one of these, no wrong answers. I mean, of course, there are wrong answers, but more than people, right? Okay, so a bit like Danny Hillis, that you think that the curve would be the point where there's more computers than people. I think you're right. I think if you look at it, especially if you use a realistically generous definition of computer that includes other things that have got microprocessors in them, I would say that's the fair definition, right? If you've got a microprocessor, a CPU, an Intel 8386 or any other variants, then you're a computer, even if it looks like you're a washing machine. That's the sort of classic example. Washing machines have indeed got microprocessors in them. They're running a program. It's somebody's job to write that program. God help them. That must be a great job. So yes, if you encode them in that sense, then it's more than people. And I think we're even getting to the point where if you look at the number of like obvious, domestic PCs that have been sold, well, you add them up over the past 30 years, where most people in the kind of the richer half of the world will have owned multiple PCs in their time. Yes, we still have really poor people who probably don't even have one yet. But I think if you run it through, you're looking at more computers than people. And of course, it's the kind of thing you can type into a search engine and ask and get various estimates. It's just an interesting thing to think about. So, for example, how many computers are manufactured each year? That's something you can occasionally find out. I've actually found that the evidence for this can be a bit thin on the ground for recent years, and 2020 has probably been a strange year because of the things that happened, of which we shall not speak. So 2020, look, whenever we're going to look back at historical graphs, there's always going to be like a strange, the 2020 anomaly, where it's like the trend wasn't followed that year. A thing happened, you know what I know. So this is possibly like an old attempt to estimate the annual production. Yeah, that's actually a dead link. I tried to fix this, but it's my attempt to edit the link didn't work. But yes, it used to be like there are hundreds of millions of PCs are made each year now. And it doesn't take too many years for that to be adding up into serious numbers and you're way into the billions. Part of this question about how many computers are there is, of course, the definition. Well, I just told you that you can say an explicit PC is obviously a computer, but I would say so is anything with a microprocessor in it, which would include your phone. And I think now people would accept that, yes, your phone is a computer, and it most certainly is, right? So certainly a smartphone. Even dumb phones, of course, have still got a microprocessor in them. So phones are computers, and there's lots of phones in the world. How many phones are there in the world? There are more phones than people. Again, we got to the point where the last time I calculated it, it's like, more than people. And that's one where even really poor people often have got phones nowadays. Take like India, where the people are living on a very small amount of money every day. But a lot of people have phones. They just seem to be such an essential part of doing anything nowadays, including financial transactions. People use phones to engage with their banks and do money transfers, in addition to the more obvious function as communication devices. So yeah, there are as many phones as people in the world. And things like cars and washing machines are all computerized these days. Here's a killer. So we've got a rough idea of how many computers and stuff there are in the world. How many transistors are there in the world? Anybody want to just even...
Probably more than stars in the galaxy.
Hey, now that's a good one. Is it in that range yet? I think you might be right, actually. It's stupidly huge. Maybe...
It's definitely more than stars in the galaxy.
Yeah,
Okay, help me out. How would you... First of all, what's your number for stars in the galaxy? 10 to the 40?
Well, in the galaxy, not in the universe.
in the galaxy.
I just googled it. I cheated.
Okay.
The stars in the galaxy, it's 100 to 400 billion. Presumably, depending how.
Right. Yes. Yeah. You're right. So on galaxy scale, it would beat it. Universe, probably not quite there yet, but galaxy is the one. Yeah. More than that. That sounds about right. Yeah. Because I'll tell you one of the numbers that I remember, which will be out of date now, right? Is that there was a point where, in fact, this might be the link to the article. I found an article which is quite old now, but it was talking about it was Intel had figured out that they think that they have, because obviously, how do you answer a question like this? It's like, well, hopefully people like Intel would know, right? Because they make the damn things, and you would like to think that they were keeping count, and you could kind of ask them to tell you how many transistors they've made, and they were talking about this is like in the kind of some year like 2015 or something like that. They thought they had got to the point where they had made it was 1 sextillion transistors, if I've got that right. And for making sense of those numbers, when you got these like the big illion numbers, the way you convert them to real numbers is as follows. If you take something like a billion, right? So the word billion, the bi part implies 2, as you probably know from its Latin or Greek root or something, right? So the bi part's 2. It turns out though that this whole scale is built on 1,000 as the base unit. So it turns out you have to take the bi and add 1 to it. So you take the 2 and turn it into 3, multiply it by 3 and you get 9, and that's the power of 10 that corresponds, right? So a billion is 10 to the power 9. Right? So again, by 2 plus 1, 3 times 3, 9. And that extends to the other ones. So if you have a sextillion, sextillion implies 6. Add 1 to it, 7 times 3 is 21. And you're in the 10 to the power 21 universe. And obviously, that's a damn big number, right? Again, you put it on like a human scale. How many people are on the planet? How many humans are alive at the moment? Yep, 7 or 8 billion. Let's use whole numbers. Let's call it 10 billion, because it will be soon enough, right? So 10 billion would be 10 to the power 10. So if you think of 10 to the power 10 as being like people on the planet, then we had a period where the number of transistors manufactured was 10 to the 21, which is, in terms of the exponent, it's more than double that. So it's 10 to the 10 times 10 to the 10. Oh, and throw another 10 in, by the way. So the result of that is it actually means that at that time, the number of transistors in the world, there were basically 10 to the 10 transistors for every man, woman, and child on the planet, right? So it's like, so the number of transistors per person is the same as the number of people on the planet itself, right? The number of people squared, which is ridiculous, right? And again, you go back to thinking, and in 1946, the number of transistors in the world was 0, because they hadn't invented them yet. And it's just incredible. If you actually try and figure out things like, how many transistors do you personally own? Or how many are you carrying right now? Right? You can kind of do that in a crude way. You think, well, where do they come from? Where are all your transistors? Obviously, if you've got a microprocessor, that's got transistors in it. And as we've seen from some of these numbers, it's in the order nowadays of billions of transistors on a microprocessor. Right? But it turns out that's not where most of them are. Most of them are in the memory chips. And we've all got lots of memory nowadays. If you take something, for example, like assume you've got like an SSD drive on your computer, or you've even got a big memory stick, or you've got a phone with decent capacity, right? So let's say you've got like about 128 gig of flash storage. So 128 gigabytes is 1024 gigabits, which is almost that many transistors. Now it turns out, actually with some flash technologies, you can get 2 bits per transistor, so it doesn't go up. You can actually scale it down a little bit, but roughly speaking, we're looking at the order of 10 to the 10 or 10 to the 11 transistors on any device with like a non-trivial amount of memory in it. So absolutely massive numbers. Yeah, that's quite an old article, but again, it was harder to find more. It's hard to find more recent ones, but it gives you an idea. Here's the one where we're talking about sextillions of transistors shipped.
Yeah, I have just Googled the estimate for the stars in the observable universe. 1 sextillion. Like maybe.
Well, there you go.
Plus or minus an order of magnitude.
Yeah. So in fact, and here have been mentioned down here as well. I had kind of forgotten that figure, but it was in my head because I remember that they were in a surprisingly, an amusingly similar ballpark. That sextillion is stars in the universe and transistors that we'd made in 2014, which is a fair while back. Now, so just from what you know already, if it was about a sextillion back then, how many is it now? Does anyone want to kind of work through their thinking? So first of all, how many years have passed?
7.
Okay, and what do we need to know about that? We want to know how many doublings it's been.
Doesn't it double every 3 years?
Right, so
Double by 3 times, so that would be 8 times as many.
brilliant. And I would say I would round it up to 10 probably, just like rough in your head, right? So I would say, yeah, it's about 10 times that now. 10 sextillion transistors. And I wouldn't be surprised if, maybe even at the upper end of that. So yeah, just extraordinarily massive numbers with these tiny little magic, super miniaturized valves that we have in all our toys. And it's our job as programmers to make them do stuff that people want done. So there you go. And yeah, you can do different versions of this, and just I went through a slight phase of trying to ask myself silly questions like this, how many transistors are here? How many transistors have I got in my house? Just to give me scale. Is this a time slot change where some people need to go? Right. Okay. Well, that's fine. And I maybe don't have too much more to say anyway. So I guess one last chance. Any questions arisen from those little digressions? I'm guessing not.
Will we start getting assignments?
Yes. So the assignments are going to start next week. What usually happens is I give you some lecture material on the Monday with an assignment that corresponds to that, and then you have 1 week to turn it in. So it looks like a few of you are itching to go, so I'll just let you go and we'll terminate it here because I don't have too much more to say, and I'll see you all again on Monday for the next full set of lectures. Bye.